up until this point, the chapters of Expect More have been drawing people into the positive side and a renewed side of librarianship and libraries. We've challenged the nostalgia of books and materials, and we've broadened it to a concept of learning and places and platform for learning. We've talked about the nature of knowledge. We've talked about how librarians can be around learning in different modes and not just materials, and how we express that in mission statements. To this point, we've really been feeding a very positive sense, but a relatively simple sense. That is, librarians, learning importance, support. Now we need to begin to add some complexity and some little harder concepts into people's understanding. We need to begin to add nuance. And the reason is that while if we just embed in advocacy a positive view of libraries, go out and fight for positive libraries, people might say, oh, I love libraries, we're going to fight for it, we're going to vote for it. By the way, don't buy these materials, don't support this group, and what are you doing here? In essence, we need to share our values and principles that can lead us into very hard, complex conversations, not just the positive side. If people are going to truly own the library, we want to make sure that they own the library in a way that matches what the ultimate missions, values, and ethics of the field are. And so that's where we're going to start here. Now, whenever we talk about ethics, whenever we talk about principles, whenever we talk about values, ultimately what we're talking about is decision-making and discretion. That it is important that when people are faced with a situation with ambiguity and choices within it, we understand what it is that guides those choices. Now, that can be seen as people having a point of view and enforcing that point of view on others. That's where we start now with a story about this idea of jackbooted librarians. That actually happened in an online conversation I was having with a librarian who felt particularly public librarians were civil servants and therefore shouldn't have discretion, shouldn't have different views of the world. They should just do their job, and they should adopt the values and principles of the people, the community that are hiring them. This is problematic because what we really want to do is not simply have automatons who get a mission and do it. We want to talk about the education, the value, the experience, the principles, the professionalism of library staff in doing their work. And that means we need to take on the complexity of this. So I begin with this idea of, hey, look, we have to have a point of view. It's important that we have a sense of what it means to be better. And that's not always going to be a simple, universally accepted definition. And I start with this idea, a quick quote from Wayne Wiggins' book. I love this quote, and I love Wayne Wiggins' book on public libraries. And it talks about it at one time. The literary novel was seen as the equivalent of pornography, that public libraries, in particular, were all about nonfiction material, and this introduction of fiction and literary novels were a bastardization of the mission of what libraries should be doing. I point this out to show, one, there can be an evolution in how we think about libraries. I mean, today, saying that libraries foster a love of reading through literature is sort of assumed, but it wasn't always so. And the way it became assumed was by proactive work of libraries and librarians making those decisions, stocking those shelves, making that argument. The way we see librarians and libraries today is a product of librarians and libraries over time having spent time shaping and having their perspective on it and refining that. In essence, proactive librarianship. And so what we're going to do throughout this chapter is we're going to talk about what guides that proactive librarianship. What are these values? We get into talking about, for example, quality and high quality materials. And the problem is with quality and high quality materials, you're representing, once again, a point of view. High quality to whom, for what, in what way? Is a presidential speech, for example, a high quality thing because it came from a president, or is it actually the opposite, in which people view politics in a really jaded view and say, oh, if it comes from the president, it must just be propaganda? So this complexity, once again, now we've got people, they're learning, they understand they're in a conversation, they love libraries, they understand it's a place to do it, and now we need to say, and it's really important because these are really important and complex conversations. And what we're doing ultimately is building up the professionalism, the importance, the view, the discretion of library staff in doing this, the experts in the librarians. And so talking a little bit about why high quality is not as simple as many people think it is. Talking about authority not being what it is. Talking about credibility not being as simple as yes, it is or is not credible, with bunches of examples. And so this is the paradox we need to put in people's minds. We collect wide volumes of materials, some of which we know or will later be found to be inaccurate. And that's okay as long as we are in the learning business. And let's explain what learning business is. So continue to talk about this. Talk about then the idea of complex community conversations. And so we begin taking on this notion of what do we mean by community? What do we mean by conversations? And this leads us into the discussion of what do we call them? Them are the people that we serve with. And this is where we take on things like customers, consumers, patrons, users, members. Now, I want to be really clear, as you read this discussion, I'm going to be pushing around the idea of calling folks members as opposed to patrons, because we don't patronize patrons, we help them. We don't 18th century oil painters that have patronage, but the idea that we have people who are part of it. They have cards, they have commitments, they're co-owning the success. I hate consumer because, one, I hate being consumed, and customer, that idea that we have this sort of transactional relationship. We want to look at something much deeper. But what a community calls itself. I had one public library that talked about neighbors. I have academic libraries that talk about faculty and students. Duh. And I have one library that talks about makers. And I have many libraries that I know and work with that they call their folks customers. And the idea is, well, it's customer service, and people are familiar with that concept, and that's fine what a community and a library decide to call themselves. But within the profession, we need to be really aware that these words have baggage, and think about those words. So this is as much a discussion for librarians as it is for members, right? Talking about what we call folks, and then coming around again that what's better is defined by the community. And since we're in the improvement business, since libraries are about improving their communities, it can't just be about what's wrong with the community. It also has to be where the community wants to go. What's the dream? What's the aspiration? And this is where we really want to begin to engage our communities in having discussions about what are our aspirations? What is the narrative that our community wants to have? Are we a place of great learning? Are we a place of literacy? Are we a place of economic development? Are we a place of innovation? Are we a place of, what is it? What is the narrative or multiple narratives that we want to pull together? And those narratives need to be based on a direction and a forward-thinking view, not simply on what is or what's wrong with folks. And so there's a lot of discussion here. Then throughout the rest of the chapter, adding more complexity. Talking about if we're in the aspiration business, if we're in the community business, if we have points of view, there are some things we need to talk about. There are some things that we do as librarians, choices we make, that you need to know why we make them. And we often try and hide this from you, but now you need to know it. Things like ebooks. It really is annoying that you could have a limited number of ebooks to check out and you have to return them in a certain amount of time when they're completely digital and there's no physical reason for it. We get that. Understand that that's not our choice, and we fight for broader, more open access, but you need to be aware that we're making choices. We have to make financial decisions. Let's show you what some of those questions are. Talking about this throughout, the idea of what titles, what fiction, what do we do with things like sharing materials. All of this is showing the reader now that what we do is hard. And what we do is in the best interest and highlighting the principles and values we use. This whole section is about the principles and values we use, talking about walled gardens, talking about ebooks, talking about all of this information so that people know that librarians aren't just simply the people there to stack and love the books or teachers in front of a library classroom, but making hard business decisions, making hard societal decisions, and using limited resources to do it. Once again, what we want people to come out of this chapter is, oh, libraries are really important. They're doing really big things. That's what we're doing with Grand Challenges. I'm really glad that we have professionals dedicated to helping to solve these problems because they're big, and I want to support that. I want to support that not just for my corner library, not just for my school library in my building, not just the academic library across the hall. I want to do this for all libraries because they're really solving societal problems. And so we're back to the idea of not just advocating for our own, but advocating for all libraries, showing that that's a complex concept, showing that we have conflict going within our communities, showing that we have competing practices, and we need librarians as much as we need libraries to help us solve those problems. We have to talk about how do we share limited resource. This is all about what I call here the complexification of librarianship for the reader. Ultimately, we're trying to answer the question, you need a master's degree for this? What we're trying to answer the question is, why do we need librarians? Why do we need people? And why is it important that they're in the thinking better business? And why is it important that these are trusted, principled professionals with ethics and values? That's what we want to get out of this chapter. Ultimately, it's a bunch of examples to show that, but the end of this is, all right, you bought learning, you bought the idea that we're platforms, you bought the idea that we're more than books, you bought the idea that we are co-owned by the community, and as co-owners, you need to know the kinds of hard issues that we are dealing with and the kinds of values and the kinds of notion of equality versus equity, of walled gardens, of the idea of resources and limitations and where we place them, and the idea of how we reach out to the communities. So we're now partners. We believe at this point in the book that we have people interested and excited and they're partners, and as partners, we now need to share our values and our struggles. So that's what we're trying to do in Chapter 5.